Section 1. The laugh heard over the Pacific, June 19, 1943. Trick Lagoon, Central Pacific. The sun blazed down on the turquoise waters of Trick Lagoon as Imperial Japanese Navy pilots prepared for their afternoon patrol. Among them was Lieutenant Saburo, the Hawk, Saito, a veteran ace of the early Pacific War. He had flown the nimble Mitsubishi Zero since the first days of battle, from the skies over Pearl Harbor to the coral reefs of the Solomons. His confidence was absolute. Rumors had begun to circulate among the Japanese ranks. The Americans had a new carrier fighter, a replacement for their clumsy Wildcat. The word was Hellcat. The name drew laughter in the ready room. Another flying brick, Saito chuckled, adjusting his flight goggles. It will fall from the sky before it reaches us. On the flight deck of the Zuikaku, mechanics fueled the Zeros, their radial engines coughing to life in a rising mechanical chorus. The air reeked of oil, salt and sweat. Pilots exchanged smirks as they imagined what kind of aircraft the desperate Americans might field next. The Zero, after all, had ruled the skies since 1941, faster in the climb, unmatched in maneuverability. What could possibly threaten it? Far to the east, on the deck of the USS Yorktown, CV-1, another pilot strapped into a brand new machine, Lieutenant J. Edward Red Walsh, a young Navy aviator from Ohio, patted the side of his aircraft affectionately, the name painted beneath the cockpit, Red F6F Hellcat. The fighter gleamed under the sun, broad wings, thick fuselage, powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. To the untrained eye, it looked cumbersome. To Walsh, it felt alive. He had flown the older F4F Wildcat and knew its limits well. The constant defensive rolling, the desperate dives to escape the Zero's razor-sharp turns. But the Hellcat was different. It was faster, stronger, meaner. He throttled up. The 2,000 horsepower engine roared to life, shaking the deck. As the Hellcat shot off the carrier, Walsh could feel it. The muscle beneath its steel skin, the defiance built into every rivet. Across the Pacific, the two worlds were on a collision course, one still laughing, the other quietly sharpening its claws. In the months to come, those laughs would turn to disbelief and fear. Section 2. The First Encounter, August 31, 1943, near Marcus Island, Western Pacific. The dawn sky was streaked with pink and gray as the first wave of F6F Hellcats formed up over the carrier task force. The ocean below glimmered like burnished steel. Lieutenant Red Walsh's voice crackled through the radio. Hellcat 1-1, to all units, stay tight, and remember your drills. No dogfights, unless you have to. Let your speed and power do the work. The mission was simple: sweep ahead of the bombers, and clear the skies of Japanese fighters. Intelligence suggested a small garrison on Marcus Island, a perfect test for the new Hellcat's combat debut. At 16,000 feet, the formation broke through a line of thin clouds. Ahead, dots appeared on the horizon, 12 of them, moving fast. Zeros. Saito was leading that patrol. He saw the dark shapes glinting in the morning light, wide-winged, heavy, sluggish-looking. He smirked through his oxygen mask. These must be the new American planes, he said to his wingman. Let's welcome them properly. The Japanese formation split with the elegance of a sword stroke. They came screaming down from the sun, cannons blazing. Walsh's canopy lit up with tracer fire. He rolled hard left, feeling the J's press into his chest. But unlike the old Wildcat, the Hellcat didn't shudder or lose speed. It responded instantly, diving into a high-speed turn that ripped the angle away from his attacker. Holy hell, Walsh muttered. She moves like a dream. A Zero flashed across his nose, and Walsh pulled the trigger. 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns roared in unison. The sound was less like gunfire and more like thunder rolling through metal. The Japanese plane erupted in flame, pieces of its wings spiraling away. Below, another Hellcat dove through the formation, taking hits but staying airborne. The rounds pinged harmlessly against its armored shell. 1 Zero after another fell away, shredded by concentrated bursts. Saito's grin faded. These new planes, they didn't break apart after the first few hits. They didn't flinch from a head-on pass, and they climbed with terrifying power. He pulled into a vertical roll to escape pursuit, his usual trick, but the Hellcat stayed with him, climbing easily, matching his every move. "This is impossible," Saito gasped, yanking the stick. Walsh lined up his shot and fired. The tracers tore through the Zero's tail, sending it spinning into the sea. The veteran's disbelief died with him. Minutes later, the skies above Marcus Island were silent. 11 Zeros destroyed, 2 Hellcats lost. The radio was filled with static and adrenaline. "Hellcat 1-1 to Yorktown," Walsh reported, his voice trembling with triumph. "Enemy fighters neutralized. This thing's a monster." On the carrier decks, the flight crews listened in stunned silence. The test was over, and the results were decisive. The era of the Zero was ending. Section 3. The Grumman Ironworks. Bethpage, Long Island, early 1943. Long before the Hellcat carved its legend in Pacific skies, it was born in the cold roar of American industry. In a factory so rugged, the Navy called it the Grumman Ironworks. Inside the massive hangars of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, sparks showered from welding torches. Engineers, mechanics, and draftsmen worked day and night under the hum of fluorescent lights. The man at the center of it all was Leroy Grumman, a former Navy pilot turned aircraft designer, short, serious, and utterly obsessed with toughness. He had listened carefully to reports from pilots flying the older F4F Wildcat men who had faced the nimble Japanese Zero and barely lived to tell the tale. "We don't need acrobatics," Grumman had said during a design meeting. "We need survivors." His engineers nodded. The Wildcat's problem wasn't courage, it was performance. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outrun it, but the Americans had one advantage. Their planes could take punishment. Grumman doubled down on that. The new aircraft XF6F1 began as an evolution, but war demanded revolution. The prototype's right engine wasn't enough. So Grumman tore it out and replaced it with the mighty Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower beast that transformed the airframe overnight. The result was the F6F Hellcat, faster, deadlier, and built like a tank. Test pilots described it as a flying anvil, with claws. It could absorb direct hits, dive like a meteor, and still land on a carrier deck. Engineers designed self-sealing fuel tanks, bulletproof glass, and thick armor plating around the cockpit. Luxuries the Zero couldn't afford. Even its nickname carried defiance. The British had their Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Americans had a Hellcat. By the time it entered mass production in 1943, Grumman's factory was churning out one Hellcat every hour. Entire families worked the assembly lines, fathers on rivets, mothers wiring cockpits, teenagers painting insignia. The sound of drills, presses, and engines echoed through the night, like a war drum. Each aircraft that rolled off the line bore the mark of its origin: raw American steel and the determination to reclaim the Pacific. Leroy Grumman often walked the factory floor quietly, running his hand along the curved metal fuselage. Somewhere, he'd say softly, "A kid will fly this and come home alive." He was right. Soon those very machines would turn the tide of the air war, and prove to every laughing Zero pilot that the age of invincibility was over. Section 4. Baptism by Fire. The Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The Pacific was calm that morning, deceptively serene. Below the rising sun, the largest naval armada in history waited. Hundreds of ships spread across the blue horizon. Carriers bristled with aircraft, decks vibrating with the steady thrum of radial engines. The air reeked of exhaust and salt. For the pilots of the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58, this day would become legend. To the men in the cockpits, it was simply another mission. Intercepting a massive Japanese strike force inbound from the Marianas. Lieutenant Red Walsh tightened his harness in his F6F Hellcat. The radio crackled with urgency. Bandits inbound bearing 310. Estimated 300 plus. Walsh exhaled. 300. That's the whole damn Imperial Air Service. The Hellcats roared off the decks of the USS Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise. More than 200 blue-gray fighters climbing into formation. The sky filled with a deep mechanical thunder. The very sound of American industry unleashed. At 20,000 feet, the radar blips became shapes, waves of Japanese aircraft, Zeros and dive bombers, their formations stretching miles across the sky. The veteran pilots among them still remembered the laughter, the arrogance they once held toward the Hellcat, but by 1944, that laughter had died. The Hellcats dove in. Tracer lines carved the air. Explosions blossomed in the morning light. The Japanese formations disintegrated under disciplined attacks. Hellcats using speed, altitude, and teamwork instead of wild dogfights. The tactic was simple but devastating. Hit fast, hit hard, and climb away before the Zeros could turn. Walsh lined up a bomber in his gun sight. A Nakajima B6N Jill. 650 caliber guns roared. The enemy aircraft burst into a fireball, disintegrating before it hit the ocean. Another Zero came at him head-on. Walsh didn't flinch. He pressed the trigger and held it. The Zero's engine tore apart mid-air. For the Japanese it was a slaughter. By afternoon the sea below was littered with burning wreckage. Pilots parachuted into the waves, their parachutes tiny white dots, drifting toward oblivion. Radio chatter from the Japanese fleet was chaos, disbelief, and despair. Rear Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the carrier Tai-Ho, watched the sky darken with smoke trails. His fleet had lost nearly all of its veteran pilots. This cannot be, he whispered. By day's end, U.S. Navy pilots had destroyed more than 350 enemy aircraft. For the loss of just a few dozen of their own, the men called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Walsh landed back on the Lexington, his canopy streaked with oil, and deck crews cheered as he climbed out, his face smeared with sweat and disbelief. The Hellcat had done more than dominate. It had annihilated the enemy's air arm. From that day, Japan would never again mount an effective carrier airstrike. In the Pacific skies, one truth became undeniable. The Zero's reign was over. The Hellcat was king.
Section 5. Lessons of Fire and Steel. Late 1944. Over the Philippines. The Pacific Air War had changed beyond recognition. The graceful dances of early dogfights were gone. Now it was pure endurance. Long-range missions, carrier strikes, island-hopping assaults that stretched men and machines to their breaking points. For the Japanese pilots who remained, most of them fresh cadets with only a few dozen hours of flight time, facing the Hellcat was a nightmare. They were flying the same Zero that had once ruled the skies, but now it felt ancient, underpowered and fragile. Lieutenant Masao Yoshida, barely 20, gripped the stick of his A6M0 as his squadron climbed through humid air above Leyte Gulf. His commanding officer's voice came through the radio, steady but grim. Remember your training. Hit hard, hit fast, and if you must die, die for the Emperor. They spotted the Hellcats first, dark blue silhouettes glinting against the clouds, flying in disciplined formation. Yoshida dove from above, firing short bursts. His bullets sparked harmlessly against the lead Hellcat's fuselage. In the same instant, the American pilot rolled and climbed, impossibly fast, before flipping down onto Yoshida's tail. The sky erupted in gunfire. Yoshida's canopy shattered. Smoke filled the cockpit. He bailed out, tumbling into the humid air, his parachute opening just in time to see the burning wreck of his aircraft spiral into the sea. He hung there, drifting, staring in disbelief. "It's not just their planes," he muttered. "It's their men. They never stop coming." Below, the ocean stretched endlessly, littered with oil slicks and wreckage. The Hellcats swept back toward their carriers in tight formation, wings level, engines humming in perfect rhythm. Back aboard the USS Enterprise, Walsh and his squadron debriefed, exhaustion written on their faces. They'd won another engagement, but the cost of victory weighed heavy. "They just keep sending more," one pilot said quietly. "Kids, barely out of training." Walsh nodded. "That's what happens when you run out of veterans. You start sending hope instead." In Washington and Tokyo alike, both nations understood what the Hellcat had achieved. It wasn't just an airplane. It was a statement. The United States had mastered the art of industrial war. Build better, train better, adapt faster. By the end of 1944, Hellcat squadrons had claimed over 5,000 aerial victories, making it the highest-scoring naval fighter in history. The ratio was staggering. 19 enemy planes shot down for every Hellcat lost. Grumman's ironworks had forged not only a machine of war, but a symbol of technological willpower. The laughter that once echoed through Japanese ready rooms was long gone, replaced by quiet dread every time radar screens showed a formation of fast-climbing blips. The Hellcat had rewritten the rules of air combat, but its greatest mission still lay ahead, a final storm of fire and fate over the Japanese homeland. Section 6. Toward the Rising Sun. The final offensive, March 1945. Over Okinawa. The Pacific Campaign was entering its final, most brutal phase. Ahead lay the Japanese home islands, defended by desperation, determination, and dwindling resources. The U.S. Navy's fast carriers sailed ever closer to Japan's shores, their flight decks stacked with the aircraft that had broken the Empire's air power. The F6F Hellcat. Lieutenant Commander Red Walsh, Aviation veteran ace with more than 20 victories, stood on the deck of the USS Yorktown as gray dawn broke over the sea. The air was thick with salt and tension. He watched as deck crews prepared rows of Hellcats for launch, engines rumbling, propellers slicing the mist. From horizon to horizon, an entire armada moved as one. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers, hospital ships. The final push toward Japan had begun. The enemy was not beaten yet. Kamikaze attacks had become daily horrors. Pilots, many teenagers, were now being trained not to fight, but to die. The skies around Okinawa swarmed with them, single-engine planes packed with explosives, diving straight toward American ships. When the radar alarm sounded, Walsh and his squadron scrambled. Within minutes, the sky above the fleet turned into a burning storm. Hellcat Squadron 3, intercept bearing 150, came the urgent call. Walsh's formation climbed hard, engines howling. Below, black columns of anti-aircraft fire reached upward, bursting among the incoming wave of attackers. Then they saw them, dozens of kamikaze planes, descending in chaotic dives, sunlight flashing off their canopies. "God, they're not even turning," muttered one pilot. Walsh's heart clenched. Take them before they hit the ships. No second chances. The Hellcats dove into the swarm. .350 caliber, tracers cut through the sky. One suicide plane exploded in a flash of orange, then another, and another, but several broke through, their engines screaming like banshees. One slammed into the destroyer bush, tearing it apart in an eruption of fire. The pilots fought with everything they had. Their eyes burned from smoke and salt. Their arms ached from the strain of violent maneuvers. Hours passed like minutes. When it was over, the sea was littered with wreckage. American and Japanese alike. Walsh landed back aboard the Yorktown, his plane pockmarked with holes. As he shut down the engine, silence filled the cockpit. He had survived another day, but the cost was rising. Over the next months, Hellcats would continue to dominate the skies, escorting bombers over Tokyo, striking airfields, and fending off the last desperate kamikaze. Their pilots had become weary veterans, their aircraft scarred but unbroken. For Japan's defenders, the once celebrated Zero had become a ghost, outmatched, outproduced, outlasted, and yet beneath the fire and ruin, both sides knew the end was near. The skies that had once belonged to the Empire of Japan now belonged to the Hellcat. Soon, the war itself would bow to a new and terrible power, one that no fighter, no pilot could challenge.
Section 7. The day the sky fell silent. August 6, 1945. Over Hiroshima, Japan, the morning air was eerily calm. Clouds drifted lazily over the city below. Quiet streets, schoolchildren walking to class, women hanging laundry on rooftops. Overhead, the sound of distant aircraft engines was nothing unusual. For years, B-29 bombers had flown high over Japanese cities on reconnaissance or air raids. People had learned to live under that hum. But this time, it wasn't just another raid. High above, at 31,000 feet, the B-29 Enola Gay leveled off. Inside its bomb bay rested the weapon that would end the war, and the world as people knew it. As the bomb fell, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The flash came first, brighter than the sun, burning through clouds and retinas alike. The shockwave followed seconds later, a rolling wall of heat and fury that flattened everything in its path. In less than a minute, Hiroshima was gone. Hundreds of miles away, aboard the USS Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander Red Walsh stood on the deck, staring toward the west. He didn't know what had happened yet, only that Tokyo radio had gone silent, and the sky felt heavier somehow. That evening, when word spread that a single bomb had destroyed an entire city, no one spoke for a long time. The men who had spent years in the cockpit, dueling, burning, and bleeding for control of the Pacific skies, realized something profound. The age of air combat had changed forever. The Hellcat, that rugged beast of steel and fire, had been the king of its time, but now a new weapon had stolen the throne in a single instant. Walsh sat alone in the ready room that night, a cup of coffee cooling beside him. He looked at a photo taped to his dashboard. His Hellcat, wings folded, crew smiling proudly beside it. The aircraft had carried him through every storm the Pacific could offer. But now there were no storms left, only silence. 9 days later, after Nagasaki, Japan surrendered, the Empire's flag fell, and the rising sun faded into history. The Grumman Hellcat had done its duty, not just as a machine of war, but as a shield for thousands of pilots who lived because of its strength. By war's end, the F6F had achieved 5,163 aerial victories, more than any other Allied naval fighter. It had fought from the Marshall Islands to Iwo Jima, from the Philippine Sea to the gates of Japan itself. It had begun as a subject of mockery, a plane the enemy laughed at, and it ended as the instrument of their downfall. As Walsh gazed at the dark horizon one last time, he whispered the words he'd heard in Grumman's factory years ago. Built to bring them home. The engines cooled, the sea was still, and the Pacific, at last, was quiet. Section 8. Legacy of the Hellcat. From warbird to legend. The years after 1945 brought peace. A fragile, uncertain peace. The roaring engines that once shook the Pacific fell silent, and the great carriers that had launched Hellcats into war now returned to harbor, their decks empty and still. But the legend of the F6F Hellcat had only just begun. Across the United States,
Surviving aircraft were repainted, restored, and reassigned. Some became training planes for new pilots entering the jet age. Others were retired to museums, proud relics of a generation that had built victory with rivets and courage. The Grumman factory that had once worked day and night for war now turned its talent toward peacetime aviation. Yet, among the workers who stayed, there was a sense of reverence for the machine they had built, a feeling that they had contributed to something that outlasted them all. Leroy Grumman himself would often be asked what made the Hellcat so successful. His answer was simple: "It brought our boys home. That's what it was designed to do." Pilots agreed. They called it the forgiving fighter, a plane that gave second chance. It could take bullets, lose an oil line, limp home on one cylinder, and still land safely on a pitching deck. For many men, that difference meant everything. In the decades that followed, aviation advanced at lightning speed. Jet fighters like the F-9F Panther, the F-86 Sabre, and later the F-14 Tomcat, another Grumman creation, took center stage. But in every pilot-ready room, one story still circulated: the story of the rugged, unshakable Hellcat that ruled the Pacific skies. In Japan too, memories of the aircraft lingered. Veterans who had flown the Zero spoke of it with a mix of respect and regret. "We'd underestimated it," one former pilot admitted years later. "We thought the Americans had built another heavy plane. We didn't realize they had built a better one." Today, only a handful of Hellcats remain airworthy. They appear at air shows, their massive propellers carving the air, their engines growling like thunder from another age. When they lift off, onlookers can still feel the ghost of that era, the courage, the fear, the rivalry that defined the greatest air war in history. As the blue silhouette of the Hellcat rises against the sky, you can almost imagine the voices of the past, deck crews shouting over the wind, pilots calling out bearings, radio static bursting with urgency. It was a time when every flight was a gamble, every landing a victory, and every machine was more than metal. It was survival. The Hellcat's legacy isn't just written in the numbers, the kills, the sorties, the victory. It's written in the lives it saved, the men it carried home, and the respect it earned from friend and foe alike. From the laughter of disbelief to the silence of awe, the story of the F6F Hellcat is more than a chapter in history. It's a testament to the will to endure and to rise again and again until the sky itself yields.